I just couldn't have written a book that didn't talk about why you're doing what you're doing. You know, what's the point of doing this compositing stuff? Is you're trying to make stuff look real, and how do you even talk about that without talking about learning to see what real looks like. But speed was kind of, it came in, and I remember reading the script for it, and I read through the script. It's a fast read, it's a fairly short script, and it's mostly action, right? And I sort of read it and like, God, there's not much here, right? I mean, I see the action stuff, but just in terms of a movie, who's gonna want to watch this? Because it didn't feel like there was a whole lot there, and of course, then when the director Jan de Bont came out and put the whole thing together, it was this amazing action movie. When you're building something as complex as a compositing tree, the ability to be able to kind of narrow down on some small pieces of it and understand it, and putting in things like being able to group a bunch of operations together and collapse them into something that looks like a single operation, just so you can understand. I mean, you've seen anybody that's done big compositing scripts; they can just be enormous.
Hi, so welcome to the VFX Artist Podcast. We often say someone whose experience has written a book on something, and in fact, our next guest, Ron Brinkmann, has written a book on compositing. So, welcome to the show, Ron Brinkmann.
It's great to be here. It's been a little while since I wrote that book, but hopefully I keep hearing that at least a few people are finding it useful still, so hopefully so.
Yeah, I think there's certain things that are timeless. I mean, you kind of wish there'd be a third edition, and I think that'd be cool to see what the kind of third edition might be. But we'll come to that later in the show. Maybe first I'd just like to kind of roll right back and sort of talk about how you yourself got started in VFX.
I mean, I'm going to have to, we need to put some sort of a quota on me saying, I remember when, or back in the day, because it's been a few years now. But yeah, I mean, I came out of university and bounced around at a couple of hardware and software companies, and I ended up working at a company called Wavefront, which I doubt anybody remembers it now, but it was one of the very early CG, 3D CG packages.
So Maya before Autodesk,
so
right?
basically, yeah, well before all that, there was back in the day. Jesus, I'm going to do that too many times. Back in the day, there was Wavefront and there was Alias, and they were the two sort of primary competitors in that 3D space. And at some point, they merged, or I think Alias bought them, and then Autodesk bought them, and somewhere along the line, that all turned into Maya. So yeah, that's the very short history of what those packages were. At any rate, I was working for Wavefront mostly in sort of a, not really a sales, but a tech support kind of a job. And there was this little company called Sony that was like, we need to have an in-house effects group, and we'd like to look at your software. And so I came out there, and I think they were already planning on this. As soon as I sort of showed up and started showing them stuff, they said, what we really need is somebody who knows how to use this. And we're just starting off, and they'd hired virtually nobody at this point, 4 or 5 people. And so they offered me a job. And it was definitely diving into the deep end of the tank. We had, especially at the very beginning, nobody that had really done very much in the way of film production. They started hiring more people to doing film production, but the guy that started it was sort of a big dreamer, but didn't quite. He had no visual effects background. He was just sort of said, "This looks cool," and he managed to sell the studio on the idea. And so for many years there, we were working out of what they call the TriStar building, which was one of the production offices at Sony, and just started doing visual effects. And we, fortunately hired a few more people that knew some stuff, and we made up a lot of stuff ourselves that we were always like, oh, I've come up with this great idea. And then later we realized, yeah, ILM's been doing that for 10 years, but good for you to come up with that idea too. So, so I ended up spending a number of years doing film production at Sony, which became Sony Imageworks. That was a name that came on after a year or two after we got started.
So that was where, that was James and the Giant Peach was one of the shows you.
Yeah, no, James and the Giant Peach was probably about midway through my my time at Sony. I mean, the first shows we worked on, I think my first credit was on the fabulous movie Last Action Hero.
Holy cow! Oh man,
with Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was, Arnold was at the peak of his powers then, and this was the big movie from Arnold Schwarzenegger, and there was all the talk about it. And then there was some other little movie that came out that about the same time called Jurassic Park, which got a little more notice than Arnold's movie did.
damn it!
But yeah, it was that was my first one. There was a few different movies there. One of the earlier ones I worked on also was Speed with Keanu Reeves, and doing things like making the bus jump over a gap in the freeway. So yeah, it started off as kind of pure visual effects stuff, and even though I'd come on board sort of as a 3D person, I knew the Wavefront software, so I knew 3D a lot more than I knew 2D. I'd done some compositing stuff. There was a really early on compositing package called, I think it was called Video Composer at the time, and it was literally, initially it would only do video resolution, and then they added the ability to do something higher resolution than that. But I hadn't really done a whole lot of compositing to that point. I'd done mostly 3D, but as a new startup kind of studio, most of the work we were getting was little kind of 2D kind of stuff. So kind of learned how to do compositing there, really. And as did all of us. And I think at that point I sort of learned how to do it, and then started teaching other people how to do it. And that was kind of the genesis of showing people how to do compositing related things, I guess.
And you were also developing a compositing software there as well, right?
So eventually, I mean, the timeline was, I was working at Sony. I was purely a production guy. Eventually, to the level of supervising the visual effects stuff as a CG soup, and we had in-house.
So just how?
Go ahead.
Just to get what sort of period are we talking about? Like the kind of getting the chronology sort of.
What year was that? I don't know.
So yeah, so from when you started at Sony, and then you sort of over a certain amount of years moved to Supervisor. I was just curious.
It was sort of a little on and off stuff. I mean, like there was a couple really early. I mean, I think Speed was sort of my first. Is that right? I'm not sure what my first supervisor credit was. I think I know on Speed was probably the first one where I could really say I earned it. It's funny because Speed was, there was a lot of little movies that came in as part of the studio. We weren't necessarily. We were sort of the pickup guys in some ways, especially early on. It was just sort of like, you guys have people that can fix this sort of thing, or can you do a little bit of this or a little bit of that? Just kind of proving what we could do and learning how to do it. But Speed was kind of, it came in, and I remember reading the script for it, and I read through the script. It's a fast read, it's a fairly short script, and it's mostly action, right? And I sort of read it, and I'm like, God, there's not much here, right? I mean, I see the action stuff, but just in terms of a movie, who's gonna want to watch this? Because it didn't feel like there was a whole lot there. And of course, then when the director Jan de Bont came out and put the whole thing together, it was this amazing action movie. But that was a few years into it that I was sort of started supervising people. But there wasn't a clear growth path. These days, I think most studios have a pretty clear growth path for people, where you start off and maybe you start off grabbing coffee for people, but you certainly start off doing fairly straightforward, simple tasks, and you just kind of you show up and you show that you're capable of doing whatever people toss at you, and you're willing to do it, and you have the right attitude. And I mean, that's, if I ever talk to people that are just getting started, that's the thing I really try to underscore is, you got to be smart and know your tools and really learn this stuff. But it's so much about, this is true of any industry, right? It's so much about working with the other people and making sure you keep your bosses happy. And it's doing great work, but it's great work in the context of making sure you're doing the great work that people want you to do. So, but yeah, so a few years in, I was starting to supervise bits and pieces. And, for a long time there, I was back and forth. I would do shots, and most supervisors would still be doing shots as well. But to your question of sort of when the software was coming about, it really wasn't we were always developing in-house software at the studio, as any studio would do. And so I spent a lot of time giving feedback on a variety of the tools, but I wasn't anything more than just one of the artists sort of saying, gosh, it'd be cool if we could do this, or, it would make a lot more sense to me if I could do this with it, kind of thing. And I think most artists, at least technical ones, I mean, I come from a fairly technical background. I've got a degree in computer science way back in the day. So, you can kind of say, I understand how this could work, and here's an idea of what we could do, that kind of thing.
On Flickr, Blast from the Past, that you had a lot of index cards with the software GUI on them, which I thought were amazing because there were sort of these hand-drawn sketches of the whole interface.
Yeah, back.
The software, which, in case people haven't used it, was Shake.
Yes, yeah. So Shake. So okay. So I'll tell the rest of the story then. So after a number of years doing production, I just finished up a big show, Robert Zemeckis' Contact, with Jodie Foster in it, and it was a great show. It was a hard show. That was right after Ken Ralston had come down from ILM to be the head of Sony Imageworks, and so he had convinced Robert Zemeckis, yeah, we can do this work, do this level of high end work here. But it was a big show, and it was definitely stretching Sony's capabilities at that point, and a lot of hours on that show, boy. And it turned out great, and the movie turned out great. But it was one of those things where, okay, I'm gonna take a little bit of a break after this one. And sort of in the interim, a couple of guys that had, sort of one of our lead programmers had decided he was going to go off and start it up, and he went off with one of the other animators, and a few other guys were kind of getting ready to be done with production for a while as well. And so that was a company that eventually be called Nothing Real, and the core of it was originally just a set of command line tools for compositing called Shake, and they kind of convinced me to come on board. Like I said, I was just sort of finished up with Contact and a little burned out with doing production, and so they had convinced me to come on board and sort of spec out, number one, how an user interface to compositing package would look like, and then also just the ability to talk to customers that, from the perspective of somebody that knows how to do it, as opposed to just ivory tower, we're a developer and we've got this compositing package, what should it do, kind of thing. So it was a good fit because I had a technical background in coding from way back when, although it's been forever since I've written code, and I had a background doing visual effects and doing compositing, and I knew the guys that were doing it, and I'm somewhat familiar with what we had built in-house that was pretty similar to what ended up being Shake. So I just, back then there was no Figma or anything that you could sit there and mock up user interfaces really quickly with. So it was all, I drew it all by hand, and me and a couple other guys, and then the developers pretty much coded a whole user interface layer as well by hand. So these days you'd be gluing a lot of pieces together instead.
Amazing. And so Shake, a lot of our listeners have never used Shake. It was the first compositing software I used that I actually got a job with. I used After Effects before, actually, but the first thing that I actually was employed to use, and I was just at the tail end when Apple killed it. So Apple bought it and killed it. Just the sad end of that software. But the question I had is very similar to Houdini in terms of the interface, although see, Houdini's a 3D app, but in terms of the way you connect the nodes and you look at them, and I was wondering who was inspired by who.
Oh boy, good question. Houdini was around before Shake came out, and I had certainly used Houdini. I used Houdini a lot on content, actually, doing some of the space stuff that at the very beginning of the show film. There's this giant fly through the universe kind of thing, and we used a Houdini quite a bit on that. But before that, the node graph kind of stuff was around in Maya and that sort of thing too. So it certainly, the node based compositing certainly wasn't something that we had done ourselves. The idea was around, but it just sort of makes sense. It's one of the things that just drives me nuts when I have to use After Effects, is that it doesn't really embrace that sort of thing, and you get these stacks and stacks of stuff. It's just, for me, really hard to sort of see what's going on half the time. So it just sort of made sense, I guess. And I think all the developers knew that that's what it needed to be too. It's just the only sensible way to kind of represent the kind of complexity that you can have in a compositing script of how things need to wire together.
When I said the similarity, it was also the fact that it's node graph, but it's got the similar idea that you would click on the little button on the left to view the output of that node.
Yeah.
That was separate from the selection.
Yeah, all the little...
Which is quite, and different to how Nuke does it, where it's a viewer node.
Yeah. I mean, it's... Yeah, I couldn't tell you, where exactly a lot of these little things came up from originally, but it just makes sense, right? That you need to understand the flow of it. I mean, the whole... I mean, I could talk for hours about, my personal opinion for how people need to interact with software and the ability to understand when you're building something as complex as a compositing tree, the ability to be able to kind of narrow down on some small pieces of it and understand it. And, putting in things like being able to group a bunch of operations together and collapse them into something that looks like a single operation just so you can understand. I mean, you've seen anybody that's done big compositing scripts. They can just be enormous and ridiculous. And, the thing that Shake was able to do and packages like Nuke can do and all that is be smart enough with their kind of memory management where you can do it all in one big script. Because there were other tools prior to that, but you'd be doing so many little bits and pieces and pre-composites and, you get one little piece working and then bake that out as a layer and save it off and then bring it in. But if you realize suddenly that something was wrong with that, you go back to your original process and you have to put everything through it again. So the ability to have it all in one big script, sometimes for better or worse, but the ability to have it all in one big flow graph was pretty key when it came to doing serious production that was efficient. And that's kind of what it's all about, right?
One of the famous traits of Shake is that there was no undo or no reliable undo. I was kind of curious about that because it was right to the end. I mean, it wasn't just nothing real. It got bought by Apple, was launched on other platforms, was used on huge shows. I think DNA last used it on Inception with their in-house one. And all through this entire history, I mean, in one sense, the node graph kind of replaced your undo because you would copy the node and you had a copy of where you worked
right.
before you worked on something. But it's kind of interesting that this production level software, it still shocks people that, that you couldn't really just press Control Z and get back to where you were.
It shocked me too. It certainly was not a design feature, I'll tell you that. Oh God, it brings back nightmares of me fighting with the developers and saying we got to put it in there. And I don't even remember who, somebody said to me, well, there's no undo in life, is there? And I was like, well, it's true, but doesn't mean I don't want one. So, yeah, I mean, at some level, we were a small group of developers and we were constantly chasing, what's the feature that needs to be in there? And you could look at undo as a feature, but there were ways around it, and careful compositors could do exactly like you said, where you just make a copy of some nodes and stick them off to the side and know that you're gonna do it. But no, I mean it was terrible. I mean I'm not gonna apologize for any sort of grand scheme of we intended it to not have an undo. It just for what I can't even remember what it was, but there was some kind of deep technical issues with keeping track of it. I think it had to do with there was too many different places where, do you put the undo at the level of if I change a slider, do I undo it? Or if I change the topology of the graph, do I undo it? It was just, I don't remember what all it was, but I'll apologize many years later to everybody that had to deal with the fact that they couldn't undo some horrible change they made to that. But to be fair, it bit me plenty of times myself too. So, I guess it does teach you good hygiene for saving regularly.
Oh, absolutely. And to be honest, the idea of an undo for life is a high concept movie idea.
Yep. Yes. I'll get to work on that. So.
And so Contact, since you put it up, did you work on the famous mirror shot?
Not really. I was there when they shot it. It was. I mean, I remember when. Actually, I was there when they shot half of it, since it was shot in two pieces. No, it was. That was done in flame. It was all done in flame. At that point, tracking was. We didn't have great tracking tools. Flame had much better tracking tools, and that shot was all about getting the match move to work right and everything. And a really excellent flame artist, Mark Holmes, did that shot. And I remember when he put it together, and I looked at it, and I'm like, oh, that's going to be the shot people remember. So, and it was just one of those things where, I mean, I think everybody was just sort of like, you're going with it, and you just sort of stop. You're like, what did I just see? And so yeah, it was a great shot. But no, that was I can't take any credit for that other than being one of the first people to say, wow, that's a great shot. So. But yeah, I mean, in Contact, I mostly dealt with the opening sequence, the giant pullback through the galaxy, which was a great fun, and a lot of miscellaneous stuff, and then a lot of the stuff at the end when they're kind of on that surreal sort of beach, and getting some of that to come together. And there was a lot of Flame, Inferno, whatever it was at the time, done there as well. Is Flame even a thing? Is it Inferno now? What the hell do they call it now?
Flame is still going. No, Flame, weirdly, it's the one survivor of all they had all these things, Flint and Smoke, and they all died. Now it's Flame. It's biggest in editorial. I was actually using it at the mill, but not for compositing, for the timeline. So they would give you an ad.
Yep.
You would conform it into Flame, and you would put your shots in.
Interesting.
Compositing in use.
Interesting.
And Warner Brothers, I know, use it to conform movies. So, yeah, the conform level online editing capabilities and the kind of level of compositing that you can do within online, it's still rocking and rolling. But
I mean, it's really sort of a
main compositing tool. It's kind of gone.
Is it interesting? Yeah, I mean, it was it was an extraordinarily expensive piece of kit. It was especially at the time when it was running on those high-end silicon graphics machines and all that. But it had some cool stuff, and just the interactivity of it was amazing. It was fun. There was this brief period of time there where the Flame artists were kind of the gods of the post world. I mean, more so in commercials, but just because of the level of productivity, and you'd get the guys that partnered up with their favorite commercial director, and they were lauded and tossed a whole lot of money back then. I mean, I remember trying to hire flame artists at compositing visual effects studio kind of salaries, and they were like, "What? Do you realize how much I can make doing commercials?" So it was tough.
They were getting transfer fees like athletes, like footballers.
Yeah.
The company wouldn't just pay them a big salary; they would pay the company they were taking them from a transfer fee. To take them.
Yeah, I remember I was dating a gal who was a flame artist at the time, and I was just like,
she was paying for it.
Exactly. But yeah, it's interesting too to me how Flame, like you said, that sort of kind of the editorial side of things, how much compositing work is keeps getting pushed to editorial. I mean, it only makes sense, right? And if you make it easy enough that you have somebody whose skill is editing, doesn't have to know the ins and outs of compositing, there's so much you can do if you have the right tool. I think that's only going to continue. I mean, I'm sure I haven't looked at the latest in Avid or whatnot, but you can definitely see that a lot of this stuff used to be compositing shots. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, Resolve has this whole node view and everything, right?
They built Fusion and stuck it in there, basically. So
that's right.
That would have been your main competitor, right, when you were running Shake.
Yeah, Fusion was definitely one of the ones we always ran up against. People tended at the higher end to buy Shake more often. But Fusion, stuck around forever, and they had a lot of cool stuff in it too. So
I feel like where Shake was strongest is actually when I was learning compositing, it just made so much sense. And that's kind of why I think it ties. And the other thing about Shake that I really enjoyed was the manual, because up until then I'd read things like the Autodesk, the Maya manual, the After Effects manual. They just were like incomprehensible, even for simple operations.
Yep.
It was clearly written for engineers by engineers, the audience being other engineers, and Shake was like having a chat with your mates down the pub about how to composite.
Yep.
But mates that are really good at compositing.
Yeah, I mean, so that the whole manual was pretty much written by my dear friend Peter Warner, who unfortunately passed away last year. But he just an amazing writer. I mean, a great artist. He was an animator that I worked with, but also just an amazing writer. And he started writing this stuff, and that's really tongue-in-cheek kind of documentation style. And we talked about it, and I'm like, is this gonna fly? And we were all kind of, well, let's find out. I mean, who cares, right? If people enjoy it and it gets the point across. So, it always, you look at the Shake manual and you look at the book I wrote, which is rather dry in comparison. And, but, we sort of knew that that's what we were coming up with. Peter was writing this thing that was going to be fun to read, and I was writing something that was hopefully going to be around for a while, but also kind of wasn't quite as much fun. And he was just a funnier guy than I am, so that's probably a lot of it too. But yeah, the manual was good. I have still had people like getting in touch with me on LinkedIn saying, hey, you don't have a copy of that manual, I just want to go read it for fun. So it's out there,
which is not something you would say about any other manual.
No, I don't think so. So I mean, I think we had.
Yeah, that's it.
To your point about how Shake sort of made sense from the compositing. I mean, we had a huge advantage. If you look at, and I spent some time working for the Foundry after I left Apple, and looking at Nuke, and there was talk at the time about, should we revamp the Nuke user interface and try and make it a little more. I always found it slightly unintuitive, and obviously that's because I had developed Shake, so it was nothing but intuitive for me. But I think Nuke was a piece of production software that just grew out of production, right? And so every time they needed something, they would bolt something on there. And I think it got a little unwieldy at times. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful piece of software, but there's still stuff about it that kind of bugged me with, the way the user interface is laid out. But that's, I can't really take that much credit for it, because they have, Shake had the huge advantage of, we'd put together compositing software, and then we got to start from scratch and build something from the ground up that was, really designed to be a piece of software that kind of built on everything that we had screwed up the first time around, or building production software at the studio. So different kind of beast. But yeah, I mean, the other thing that we really tried to do with Shake was trying to just make it really kind of thin at some level, in terms of, it was just a direct representation of what your compositing graph was doing. It was just, very direct representation of what you were thinking, how you laid it out.
Yeah, and actually, the Nuke and its Colon iteration has got a lot of Shake-like attributes. So for new users who may have never used or heard of Shake, for example, if you're a Nuke user, you'll be connecting masks. You'll have a mask input on almost all your grade nodes and so on. And that's a Shake feature that wasn't originally in Nuke. Nuke used to pipe the mats and have different mats with different channels.
Yep.
And then actually, you just plug a mat into the side. That's a Shake feature.
Yeah.
And now recently they've just added the Shake to remove your node.
Excellent.
As a new feature in Nuke like 13. So,
yep.
It's coming full
10, 15 years later, but good. That's good. I mean, I think I'm curious if anybody listens to this podcast and is still using Shake, because and we can talk about the end of days for Shake, but at the end of it all, when Apple decided to kill it, we actually did provide source code to some of the bigger studios out there. You said you worked at the Mill. I think the Mill bought a copy of source code. A few places, got a copy of source code and ended up integrating it into their workflow. And so I'm curious if, seems like a lot of the London studios particular. I'm curious if any place like, DNEG or Mail or whoever still have bits and pieces of Shake laying around in their workflow, or is it just too far gone at this point?
I think now, yeah, I think it's gone. From what I understand from speaking to artists who were there, and I wasn't there, but Inception was the last Shake show at DNEG.
Got it.
And that was it. Which is a pretty good swan song. I mean, you've got to say
That is.
the last comps of these, they composited Inception in it. Well,
I like it.
You know what you're going to say.
That's good. That's a good story.
So
I'll stick with that one.
At this point, you've been doing 3D at Alias. You've gone to Sony, you've become a compositor, you've been training people in compositing, you've left and developed and promoted a compositing software, which was the dominant one for a long time. And then at some point you left again and you did something new. You wrote a book about compositing.
Wrote a book.
Which...
Yeah, I mean, the books...
How did this...
Well, the book started... I mean, technically it started when I was still at Imageworks, and we did a SIGGRAPH class, myself and a couple other guys, Jerome Chen and Gary Jackamuck, we were all sort of 3D artists, and so this is pretty early on, and we just did a course on compositing, because nobody had really done a compositing course at SIGGRAPH, and just given a talk about what is the basics of compositing. And so we put something together that was, very broad overview. I don't remember how long the course was, but I think it was just a half-day course, and tossed in a few examples from whatever the state of the art was at the time. Somebody can go back, I'm sure, the SIGGRAPH archives have the course somewhere on there. And I ultimately kind of fell to me to pull all the pieces together for that course. I did most of a good chunk of the writing on it, and so I had that. And whenever, I was sort of thinking about doing a book at that point. It's just one of those things where, if you've worked your way up and then you're to the level where you're supervising and you're hiring a lot of people, you basically become a teacher, right? You basically have to explain to them, specifics of how this studio works, but also just a lot of learning for the novices about how compositing works or how 3D works or whatever works. And so I just found myself sort of explaining the same things and the same basic concepts, and not just compositing concepts, but just visual concepts, how to shadows, add up kind of things, and, understanding where the light's hitting to make your composite look real, and all of those pieces that a good artist has to develop the eye for. And I just kept sort of saying the same things over and over again, and it's just like, somebody needs to write a book about this thing. So it was right when I left Sony and started doing the software company. I'm like, I'm also going to take this time to write a book on it. And it dovetailed nicely, because same thing, if you're trying to sell software, the more people that know how to use it, the more people that are capable of using it to the best level, the better. So yeah, it was just sort of, my world was a whole lot of compositing from a couple different directions there for a while, which is always funny to me, since, like I said, I kind of started out in the 3D world, but but I love compositing, and I just the fact that you sort of are the person that gets to put the final touches on the shot and really make it sweet at the end of it all, I think is a nice place to be. I mean, the downside is, shit rolls downhill, right? So you're at the end of the chain, and inevitably it's the compositing guys who are pulling the all-nighters to get the shot out the door. The 3D artists have delivered all their elements, and at least back in the day it was, where everybody else was done with their shots, and the poor compositing team was just sweating bullets to hit the deadline. But
I think that's always going to be
it is,
yeah. Pass the comp.
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly. And
this lighting's good. Yeah, final lighting. It's definitely not final comp.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I really like, I was looking at. I mean, I know that this is a second edition, so I presume there were some revisions, but I did really like just the structure of it. I've just got a copy open here, just out of the camera, but there was the fact that one of the the first chapter gives you an introduction and an actual example of compositing from way before digital, in fact way before film, which is this photo image.
Yeah,
this photo compositing here.
composite photograph. Yeah.
But then I like that once you get in the second chapter, and probably these are the I think the bits that are most relevant to this day, and things like this chapter, whole chapter about learning to see and just observing colors, observing light, observing shadows, observing, all of these things, all these kind of observational skills that, are often, if I find a new artist as a junior coming in, that's what they're missing. A lot of them have like really amazing software skills, and they know all these kind of crazy modern tricks, and there are obviously more and more modern tricks you can learn. But sometimes, they can't, for example, tell a lens just by looking at the at the kind of arrangement of objects in space and things like that. There's like little observational skills that just really, really, and I like the fact that that's like right there, front and center of the whole thing before you even get into anything. And it doesn't actually talk about any specific software. So the fact that this book is, now.
Well, and that's the second edition, probably.
So
I don't know. So
like,
yeah,
15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, but it kind of had to be that way. That I just couldn't have written a book that didn't talk about why you're doing what you're doing. What's the point of doing this compositing stuff? Is you're trying to make stuff look real, and how do you even talk about that without talking about learning to see what real looks like? Ultimately that's a skill that can't necessarily be taught. It's just somebody that and some people never quite seem to get it, and other people are just sort of naturals at it. But just basic things, like I said, how many times did I see people have a shadow of 3 different elements and they just layer them on top so the shadows add up, even though there's only one light source? It's just like, no, it's only one light that's being blocked. You don't get to have 3 times the shadows adding up on top of things. So, but yeah, I mean, I wrote the book intentionally to be, and this is just being lazy and greedy, right? I didn't want to have to be revising this thing all the time. So I tried to write something that could stick around for a while, and it would be as timeless as possible. And that's intentionally why I didn't put any specific, compositing software in the forefront of that. I mean, otherwise it would have been a manual. Peter was writing the manual for Shake, and in spite of the fact that the other people would kind of nudge me towards, well, don't you think you should be using Shake in all these examples? And I said, no, I just want to have very genetic kind of things, and I think it's done well just because of that, because you can still pick it up. And most of this, I mean, there's things in there that, if I ever did do an updated version of this, it would just be, here's the list of things that my book that's now completely obsolete out of my book. And I think that, but there's, the basic stuff I think is still there. But yeah, I mean, who the hell needs to know how to do a convolution kernel anymore? You got a button and you don't even have to think about it. For me, the crazy thing is sort of what is this space going to look like in another 5 years with all of the AI tools? Because, up until a couple of years ago, everything was kind of iterative and building on top of existing concepts, right? I mean, you can have a whole bunch of extra channels, and there's all kinds of cool stuff you can do, and there would be new algorithms for how things could fit together. But these days, the sense of just tossing an AI, I mean, I'm seeing papers that are being published that are literally, teaching an AI to do compositing. And I say that not because everybody is worried about, okay, when is this going to take my job? And I don't think that's going to happen right away, but I think what it's going to do is just give the artists, the people that know how to see, the ability to be so much more productive. I really think that, I mean, my God, the amount of time that we would spend trying to pull a clean blue screen or something like that, in certain situations. And it's not like it's trivial for every one of them nowadays, but clearly, I mean, you tell me, I assume that most studios have ways of keying things that are starting to become based on AI that, just make it easy. So much easier.
I mean, at the moment, it's still iterative, and it still feels like there's, yes, you can do it faster and you can iterate faster, but you're still using a lot of the brute force. The techniques aren't sort of massively, like you said, there's an iterative improvement. You can definitely see everything's a little bit faster.
Hmm.
You've got a few more tools, you've got a few more things to do with your edges and so on. Having said that, this is when the AI is rolling in. And actually, I mean, most of the compositing software is pretty old. I mean, all of it, is built on top of structures that were around at the same time as Shake, right? Like
Yeah,
Nuke, days from around the same time.
I'm sure. I'm
Presumably, there's
sure.
certain
There's
amount of code
there's no
base that's
reason to
still
rewrite
around
it
from
if it's kind of
those
doing what it needs
days.
to
And
do.
these,
It's gonna, it's kind of amazing in some ways that Nuke in particular has had as long of a run as it had, and nobody came along. I think that partially speaks to, it's not that profitable of a space that somebody can come in and devote the resources to recreate or create a new piece of software that's as deep as Nuke is. I mean, there's just so much in there, and it would take a massive team to try and come up with a new compositing software that's duplicating what Nuke is capable of doing. And why bother? Because everybody's got their workflows based on it. But I think, I'm not completely up to speed on this. I know that like there's what's that company? Runway is a company that's starting to produce pure AI kind of tools for doing similar sorts of work. But it's going to take a whole different workflow. It's going to take a completely different mindset for some of this. And I mean, that's going to be fascinating to me to see where this all ends up. It's, but I think the artists are still going to have to be involved because, the key thing that, I've spent a lot of time playing in Midjourney, and it's cool. It's cool as shit what comes out of it, right? I mean, you look at that stuff and it just blows your mind. But then when I'm like, oh, but I really want to tweak this one little tiny thing that's bugging me, forget it, right? You can't come up with a series of text prompts that says, I need this highlight decreased by 10%, and I want the angle of the head to be tilted by 5 degrees. It's just eventually we'll get there, kind of, maybe. But I think it's going to be more of this kind of world where, you have control images, and you may generate. You're going to be generating. This is already what people are doing, right? You generate sort of a mock-up using a basic 3D posing package or something, and then you let the AI do some work on it, and it's going to be some back and forth, and it blows my mind how much it's going to change in the next 5 years. The next 5 years are going to be so radically different than the past 15 years in terms of the change that's going to happen.
Yeah, you see a bit in Nuke. There's the copycat node. So essentially, one example is you might do
Right.
you might work on a few frames and use that as your training data.
Yep.
And then you, rather than tracking the patch across, you use that as training data, and then you run the training on that shot, on other shots. And then this is where the cool thing about of course AI-based workflows like that is, if you have 25 shots that are pretty much the same thing. On Good Omens, I'm just saying because I got the jumper on, but
Right.
that he had these contact lenses that are like cat eyes or reptile
Oh,
eyes.
right.
But while he's acting, they just kept rotating. So there were a lot of shots. They took 20 minutes. They were pretty quick and easy to do, but they were just
Right.
all through the show. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these shots where his contact lenses had rotated around. Now that's the sort of thing where an AI tool would storm through it. Right? You would do 20 of them, and you would train it, and then you would let it rock and roll, and you might even have a tool that you can just give the editor and just go apply this.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That the editor will start to pick up more and more of these things too. In some ways, it's a better place for some of this, just because if you can have a single button that an AI can do something and the editor doesn't have to understand much behind it, it's I could see it. I could see it ending up in editorial as much as anything.
Or even in Resolve. There's the tools to remove. In sound, there's the tools to remove noises and so on, and they're pretty crazy what they can do. So if you had the guys from Nothing Real or another startup came up and
Right.
said, we want you to build a new compositing package like now.
Well, my first plan would probably be to see if somebody would let me go sit back in production for a few hours and figure out what the hell the world looks like these days. I don't. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's AI based. It's something where I think you would go back to first principles of what are the problems that are being solved. You know, what are the roadblocks that you hit when you're putting together a shot? Because part of me feels like it's probably not. It's not always going to be a compositing solution. I think you're going to find something else where there's this feedback loop between here's the image and I mean there's kind of two things, right? There's compositing is used for fixing stuff, right? There's a whole lot of, like you talked about, the contact lenses and all that kind of fixing level of work is sort of in one bucket, and I think you just sort of need to figure out what kind of problems there are. And then the other half of it would be full-on image creation, you know, full synthetic imagery or nearly full synthetic imagery. And I think that's probably where it's really going to get weird, where you're going to be, you know, we always used to joke back in the day of, because when most directors and producers didn't really understand this technology that well back then, right? And so for them, the joke was always, yeah, you know, they want us to press the generate a dinosaur button, and it's easy, right? Just hand it over to the VFX guys. They press the button for generating a dinosaur, and there you go. But man, these days it's sort of like there's going to be some kind of crazy feedback loop. A lot of it may be on set of I need to see my creature in this scene, and you can give me a quick rough comp that's probably fully articulated and animated and ready to go, and just, you know, having the AI produce images, and you can sit there and spitball it. And so I mean, I probably wouldn't do a classic compositing package so much as I would come up with more tools for, you know, on set AI based integration of putting cool shit on the page, right? Putting cool images on the screen and seeing how they all kind of fit together. For me, what's exciting is sort of the idea that, you know, we can actually. I'm probably more excited about where animated movies can go with all of this. That, you know, it's and sort of where that line between an animated movie and a live action movie. It feels like there's such a hard line right now, and you know, either say that looks real or that is looking stylized. But even the style, you know, every Pixar movie, I mean, beautiful stuff, but they all kind of look the same. It's all kind of the, you know, the same basic style. And, you know, I want to see some cool ass thing that maybe looks like a watercolor, but, you know, has true volumetric sense to it. And, you know, that kind of stuff is I would find that more interesting. You know, tell stories that need a different look.
I mean, there's Sony. I mean, I guess you got Into the Spider-Verse is very different, and the Mitchells versus the Machines that are doing this painterly look. And then you had, you know, working, ILM did Rango, which used their sort of photoreal approach and made it look really weird and crazy. So there are elements of those kind of different approaches going. I guess Pixar's got its house style and it works, it's successful, so I guess they're going to stick with it. But it's good for other people to come in and do it.
Yeah, I'm certain. Yeah, and I'm certainly not, you know, Pixar is fully capable of pushing the envelope in a whole lot of different directions. But like you said, it's sort of, it is a house style, and it's sort of, so it's interesting to see what, you know, who's going to come out with something that's very different. I mean, Into the Spider-Verse is a great example, though, where, you know, there's bits and pieces of that, you know, just little tiny snippets where they do something that's completely different style. And I'm like, yeah, let's see more of that. That looks so cool.
Another one was the Lego movie where, you know, they just went, there's no motion blur. You know, the motion blur is bits of Lego. Everything is made of bits of Lego. All the explosions are bits of Lego.
Right.
And, you know, it's a stop motion movie, but it's CG.
But it's all CG. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, so I just think that the AI stuff is going to, I mean, first of all, it's just going to give people a lot more ability to spitball different weird ideas, different looks just based on that. But then I think, you know, it's only going to be, you know, a matter of a year or so before you can put out full animated movies that are, you know, Mid-Journey-esque kind of thing. So we'll see. It's cool to me because it's certainly democratizing who can make these movies and who can do a feature-length movie. And it's kind of trite to say it, and I think a lot of people say that, oh yeah, anybody's going to be able to make this in their basement, and they're not, because most people don't have the visual sense to make something that really looks cool, and don't have the storytelling sense to really put it together in a compelling way. But what it does do is take things a generation removed to where you can get a couple or a few talented people together who have their own specialties and can produce something that is going to be competitive with the stuff that the big studios do. But it's going to take some very dedicated people to do that, at least for the next few years.
What do you think have you been following some of these sort of ethical debates that are around AI?
I know. I'm no expert. It's a really tough, I don't have a strong position on it. I mean, I totally get the sense that, a lot of these artists, their work was used to train the AI to do certain things. Full stop. There's no question about that, right? And but then again, a lot of traditional artists looked at a whole bunch of other things too to develop their own style. I think it's kind of a false equivalency to say, a human does it or an AI does it, and that's the same thing, because it's not. I don't think that's a fair comparison. I guess my hope is that as new training models, or as new models are trained, somebody's going to do the hard work of figuring out attribution and being able to trace backwards, what parts of this went into that. Artists are going to have to be able to opt out and say, I don't want my stuff used for this training data. Honestly, I don't think it's going to make much difference if certain artists opt out of something, and it's probably a kind of a lost cause. But having something where you could go in and say, there's some micropayments due to 100 different artists because this really hits in the zone of, and I would hope that maybe if enough of that's happening and the micropayments are in place, that, a prolific artist that has a unique style that somebody's kind of wanting to emulate, it just sort of algorithmically spits out that, hey, here's a check for some amount of money that kind of reflects what was spent to create this. So... But man, it's a hard problem.
So like hip hop and sampling of old 70s artists and that kind of thing.
Yeah, very true. And then that took a lot of lawsuits, and it's still ongoing stuff. And I think there's been some weird decisions made that aren't necessarily fair on that one either. But at least people are trying to. Yeah, who was it that? I mean, it was some artist that looked at the credits of another artist's work, the credits on the album, and how many writers had been credited, right? And they were like, I don't understand how can this many people have been used to write the song? And then they explained it that, this is the samples that were used, and these people are getting credit because samples was used. And I think that's cool. I think that's fair. It gets a little unwieldy when you're trying to, figure out where you put that credit list, since we don't have album artwork anymore in the back of an album to look at, but. I just hope that somehow they can kind of be able to credit back to the artists that sort of defined a style.
I mean, you would think it would be able to even hyperlink you to the artist, right? I mean, we don't have the album art, but we do have the ability to kind of find any artist, or anyone in the world, if you want to. And so I guess as we're sort of coming towards it, before we sort of move to the end, I really wanted to ask you what you're doing now, because the last podcast I heard you on, which was a long time ago, which was on FX Guide, you had left VFX and you had moved, I believe, to Amazon. Is that right?
I did. I worked for Amazon for a while.
And now you work for something else. So I was curious about what the post VFX Ron Brinkmann is doing.
A whole lot of little stuff, and trying not to have a regular 9 to 5. I was at Amazon for a while. That was a completely right turn. It was, make a long story short, I was at a conference. I was kind of talking about visual effects-y sort of things, but it was after I'd mostly moved out of the visual effects world, after I'd left Apple. And some guy named Jeff Bezos happened to be in the audience, and we chatted afterwards, and I you know, I think I was doing the second edition of my book at the time, and I was like, you know, it'd be cool if, as a book writer, I could have some of these tools for writing and connect with the audience. And so anyway, I wrote, you know, some half deranged manifesto and sent it over to Bezos because he'd given me his card. And, you know, he writes back to me, writes the email back, you know, we've been thinking about a lot of this stuff, which I later realized was probably his legal disclaimer. We've been thinking about a lot of this stuff, but we need somebody that could kind of implement some of it. Is that you? You know, it was a very Jeff kind of way of hiring somebody, I guess. So yeah, I worked at Amazon for a while doing things that were related to book technology, you know, and bits and pieces of it kind of touched on what you can do in a Kindle and all that kind of thing. It was sort of a weird experience. Amazon has a very Amazonian way of doing things, and I didn't last more than a couple of years there. I was just kind of like, yeah, this is not. I mean, it was a combination of things. It was up in Seattle, and I'm used to sunny Southern California, so you know, too much rain. But and I got family back here, and all kinds of, you know, a lot of good reasons. But also just the Amazon kind of methodology was fairly rigid in some ways, and I was just getting tired of working for big companies too. So as to what I'm doing now, I mean, I've sort of, you know, bounced around. Me and some friends had done some iPhone apps a while back, but those, you know, we've shut all those down because they never really got much traction. Most of what I'm doing is kind of talking to tech companies. I'm investing in tech companies, you know, kind of doing the angel investing thing with some interesting technology companies that are not necessarily even close to being, you know, compositing or visual effects related. But yeah, I mean, between just, like I said, chatting with friends and bouncing ideas off and then doing a little bit of angel investing here and there, that's kind of what takes up my day. So, yeah. Keeping busy, though. It sure seems to be keeping me busy no matter what.
Yeah, it sounds like you're not. You would. It sounds like it's very much like, oh, you could sit on a beach and do investments in the morning, but there's stuff, I guess, that keeps you scratching your head most of the day.
There are
right?
days that, well, you know, that, I mean, I've got a couple of kids that fill up the rest of my time. So, but yeah, it's I kind of got a late start on having kids, so I've got some somewhat younger kids that are still keeping me plenty busy. So between that and yeah, just sort of trying to keep my fingers in interesting things, that's kind of what's keeping me busy.
Sounds like a good place to be, though.
Can't complain. I cannot complain.
Very cool. So, as a closing note, I mean, you did actually touch upon some advice, but what advice would you give someone starting out in VFX, or someone just leaving VFX and thinking of moving on to something else?
I mean, you know, starting in VFX is kind of like I said, you know, it's most of the advice is stuff you should get with any job, stuff that for whatever reason we never got taught at college, at university, which is, you know, think about the people you're working with, think about the people you're working for, think about what they want, show up, do the work, don't be a prima donna, you know, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I worked with some incredibly talented visual effects artists or artists in general, right, who have no desire to work with them again because it was just like, this is too hard. You're too much of a pain in the ass. So don't be a pain in the ass. That's my number one piece of advice for anybody starting out. Don't be a pain in the ass. Be good, but don't be a pain in the ass. Yeah, if either for somebody starting out or somebody that's wanting to move on, I just, you know, it's too easy to say it, but figure out where some of this artificial intelligence stuff is going. I mean, it's incredibly fun is the thing. There's so much cool stuff happening and it's changing every day. I'll see something new. I'm like, that kind of blows my mind. So, yeah, I'd be, you know, in my spare time, if I was starting off in this, I'd just be playing with all that kind of stuff and seeing what, because the bottom line is, you know, see what you can make stuff, right? Make cool things. Anybody that's gotten into the visual effects industry or the film industry in general, they want to see cool stuff on the screen. They want to tell cool stories. And I think these days, just give yourself time to do that. Give yourself time to just explore cool stuff.
Brilliant. That's awesome advice. And I mean, we've already got like a potential plan here, right? Like your whole micropayment system. That's almost like the kind of step from Napster to Spotify, right there.
It's true. Yep, it's true. I'm not. for me, it sounds like a little bit of too much accounting work versus making pretty pictures. But somebody should do it. Somebody go out there and do that for me, okay?
Somebody go out there and do that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So, well, and lastly, do you think you'll ever do a third edition? Or
Oh man, I've been asked that so many times. Now, the short answer is probably no. But if somebody really wants to do a third edition, I will happily hand over the reins. I mean, and I'm serious here. Somebody should probably do a third edition. If they really think they are up for doing it, they could get in touch with me and we could figure out something where, all the existing content. I'm sure my publisher would be like, sure, let's have somebody else do a third edition and build on this existing content. I have no problem with that whatsoever. You do all the work. I'll keep my name slightly somewhere on the cover of the book, and Bob's your uncle. I like it.
Very cool. Thank you so much, and have a lovely rest of your day.
All right, it was great chatting. Thanks, Dan.